Sometimes, a single broken moment can lead us to everything we never knew we needed. When a struggling single dad stopped to help a woman stranded in the middle of nowhere, he thought he was just fixing another luxury car. What he didn't know was that he was about to mend something far more precious: 2 broken hearts, and maybe even his own. Tonight, journey with us through a story of unexpected kindness, second chances, and a love strong enough to weather any storm. If you believe in the quiet miracles of love, hope, and redemption, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Join us for more heartfelt stories that remind us, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness change everything. Now, sit back, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Ben Carter wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his greasy hand, the Texas sun beating down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt outside his garage. His fingers, rough and calloused, worked instinctively, tightening a bolt on the old Ford pickup perched on the lift. Mason, his 9-year-old son, sat cross-legged nearby, humming softly as he fiddled with a battered toy truck that had seen better days. Life hadn't exactly gone the way Ben had once imagined it. Dreams of building his own auto shop, of raising a family in a house with a big wraparound porch, had crumbled like dust after his wife's cancer diagnosis. Now, it was just the 2 of them against the world, scraping by one transmission repair at a time. Still, Ben had long ago made peace with the hard edges of his life. What mattered most was sitting right there, tracing tire tracks in the dust with his toy truck. Mason, the brightest light in Ben's battered world. A low rumble in the distance caught his attention. Squinting against the glare, Ben spotted a glint of silver hurtling down the county road like a comet. It wasn't the sort of vehicle you often saw in a town where rusty pickups and weather-beaten sedans were the norm. No, this was something altogether different. A sleek, low-slung luxury car, polished to a mirror shine, practically screaming money and big city arrogance. He barely had time to straighten before the car hiccuped, coughed a plume of smoke, and rolled to a pitiful stop right at the edge of his lot. Ben sighed, tossing his rag onto the workbench. Rich folks passing through usually didn't want help from the likes of him, until they needed it. The driver's side door swung open, and out stepped a woman in heels entirely unsuitable for Texas gravel. She was elegance wrapped in tension, tall, striking, her blonde hair pulled into a neat twist, her dark sunglasses failing to hide the panic tightening her mouth. Ben crossed the lot at an easy pace, Mason trailing after him. "Afternoon, ma'am," Ben drawled, offering a lopsided smile. "Looks like your ride's had better days." The woman pushed her sunglasses up into her hair, revealing clear blue eyes that were every bit as sharp as they were tired. "It just died," she said, the hint of a northeastern accent curling her words. One minute it was fine. The next, it started smoking. Ben crouched beside the car, his practiced hands already moving, popping the hood with a flick of his wrist. A thick, oily smell curled into the air. "Looks like your radiator blew," he said, glancing back at her. "Could be worse." "Could be worse," she repeated faintly, as if the concept was foreign to her. Ben straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You're lucky you broke down here. Closest help otherwise would have been 15 miles that away." He gestured toward the endless, empty stretch of highway. The woman hesitated, then offered a hand. "Victoria LaRue." The name clicked somewhere in Ben's mind. He'd seen it on a billboard outside town, advertising a chain of luxury car dealerships, some kind of automotive royalty. "Ben Carter," he said, shaking her hand, feeling the manicured neatness of her grip against his rough, oil-stained fingers. Victoria's gaze flicked toward Mason, who offered a shy wave. Her lips softened into a small smile. Ben could tell she wasn't used to this kind of vulnerability. Stranded, dependent on a stranger in dusty overalls. Her body language was tight, guarded, as if she were holding the world at arm's length. "Can you fix it?" she asked, voice carefully neutral. "I can patch it enough to get you moving," Ben said, "but you'll need a new radiator sooner rather than later." She exhaled, a long, weary sound. "Do whatever you have to. I have somewhere I need to be." Ben nodded and got to work. He felt her eyes on him as he moved, measuring, calculating. Rich people were always sizing up everyone and everything, deciding what mattered and what didn't. Still, he worked with the same care he would for any customer. His hands were steady, his movements precise. Nearby, Mason kept up a soft, tuneless humming, his toy truck abandoned in favor of watching Ben work. At one point, Ben glanced up and caught Victoria staring not at the car, but at Mason, her expression strangely unreadable. "You got kids?" he asked without thinking. She blinked, caught off guard. "No," she said after a pause. "No, I don't." There was something brittle about the way she said it, like a door slammed shut. Ben didn't push. Everyone carried their own scars. An hour later, the car roared reluctantly back to life. Ben wiped his hands and stepped back, giving Victoria a nod. "Good as it's gonna get," he said. "Should get you where you're going, but don't push her too hard." Victoria slid behind the wheel, her fingers brushing the steering wheel, as if it were an old friend she no longer trusted. She hesitated, then leaned out the window. "Thank you, Ben." He tipped his cap. "Drive safe." The car rolled forward, easing back onto the highway, but not before Victoria glanced in the rearview mirror, catching one last glimpse of the dusty mechanic and the boy with the shy smile. Ben stood there, hands on his hips, watching the silver car disappear into the horizon. Just another day, just another stranger passing through. He had no way of knowing that his simple act of kindness had just set into motion something extraordinary, something that would break open his quiet, wounded world, and hers. Forever. The next morning, Ben was back under the hood of another battered pickup, the sounds of Mason's laughter echoing faintly from the side lot where the boy was playing with a tangle of stray dogs. The air smelled of motor oil, dust, and impending summer heat. He was tightening a stubborn bolt when the sharp crunch of tires on gravel caught his attention. Wiping his hands on a rag, Ben stood and squinted toward the road. He wasn't prepared for what he saw. Victoria LaRue, in a pale blue sundress and, God help her, another pair of impractical shoes, stood next to her gleaming silver car. This time, she wasn't stranded. She was smiling. Tentatively, but it was a smile nonetheless. Ben raised an eyebrow and sauntered over, rag tucked into his back pocket. "Miss LaRue," he greeted, voice dry. "Back so soon? Don't tell me you broke her again." Victoria shook her head, a faint laugh escaping her. "No. She's purring like a kitten, thanks to you." Ben crossed his arms, studying her. "Then what brings you to my humble establishment?" Victoria hesitated, as if uncertain how much truth she wanted to offer. Finally, she said, "I had a few hours to kill before my next appointment, and I thought Mason might like this." She reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a brand new toy truck, bright red, still in its packaging, the kind of thing that would have made Mason's eyes light up like Christmas morning. Ben's first instinct was suspicion. Charity from rich folks always came with strings. But when Mason ran up, eyes wide, and Victoria knelt to offer him the gift, Ben saw there was no condescension in her face, only a wistful kind of longing. Mason beamed, clutching the truck to his chest. "Thank you, ma'am," he chirped. Victoria's smile softened, the tight lines around her mouth easing. "You're very welcome, Mason." Ben cleared his throat, feeling awkward. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Victoria said simply, "but I wanted to." She stood, brushing imaginary dust from her skirt. "Besides, she added, tilting her head. "I thought I might get a tour of your kingdom." Ben chuckled despite himself. Not much to see. A couple of busted engines, a few stubborn transmissions, and enough grease to drown a man. Victoria's eyes sparkled with amusement. "Sounds thrilling." Mason tugged on Victoria's hand. "Come see Daddy's secret room." Ben groaned inwardly. The secret room was nothing more than a battered storage shed, out back where he kept old car parts and half-finished projects. But Victoria, to her credit, allowed herself to be led with royal dignity across the gravel lot. Mason flung open the shed door with a flourish. Inside, chaos reigned. Tools, oil cans, hubcaps, and an ancient jukebox that hadn't played a note in years. Victoria stepped inside and turned slowly, taking it all in. Her fingers trailed lightly over the dusty jukebox. "What's this?" she asked. "Old Wurlitzer," Ben said, leaning against the doorframe. "Belonged to my granddad. Used to light up and play country classics all night long." Victoria pressed a few buttons experimentally. Nothing happened. Ben crossed the shed, opened a panel, and fiddled with a few wires. The machine groaned to life, lights flickering erratically. A moment later, a crackling voice filled the shed, singing a slow, nostalgic tune. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." Ben froze. So did Victoria. Mason, clutching his new toy truck, looked between them with wide, curious eyes. For a moment, time seemed to stretch and hold its breath. Then Mason, in his clear, sweet voice, began to sing along. Not loudly, not perfectly, but with the pure, unaffected heart of a child. Victoria pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening. Ben swallowed hard, emotion knotting in his chest. When the song ended, the shed fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft whir of the jukebox. Victoria turned to Ben, her voice low and thick. "He has a beautiful voice." Ben nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it came out rough. "Takes after his mama." Something shifted in Victoria's face then, something deep and almost painfully tender. Without thinking, she bent down and whispered something into Mason's ear. The boy giggled and nodded vigorously. Before Ben could ask, Mason scampered outside, waving his new truck in the air. Victoria faced Ben, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "Would you maybe let me help you fix this place up a little?" Ben blinked. "Fix up the garage?" Victoria shook her head, smiling faintly. "No. Fix up the jukebox, fix up the shed, fix up. Whatever could use a little more light." Ben studied her, seeing beyond the designer clothes and polished veneer, seeing the woman who had lost something too, long before her car ever broke down on his doorstep. Maybe it wasn't just engines that needed fixing around here. Maybe it was hearts. He offered her a slow, genuine smile. "You sure you can handle getting a little grease under those manicured nails, Queen LaRue?" Victoria laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that lit up her whole face. "I think I can manage," she said. The next few weeks unfurled with a kind of unexpected grace, like an old song slowly finding its rhythm again after years of silence. Victoria LaRue, the woman who once lived in penthouses and boardrooms, began spending her afternoons under the humble tin roof of Ben Carter's garage. She showed up in jeans and simple cotton blouses, her hair tied back in a ponytail, sneakers replacing her high heels. If anyone from her old life could have seen her now, elbow deep in grease and laughter, they wouldn't have recognized her. Ben certainly hadn't expected it. At first, she came under the pretense of checking on the jukebox repairs. But soon, she was there, helping Mason organize bolts by size, sanding old hubcaps, wiping down dusty shelves. Mason adored her. There was no hiding that. He trailed her like a loyal pup, asking endless questions and hanging on her every answer. And Victoria, well, something about the boy's wide-eyed innocence and Ben's quiet steadiness seemed to work a kind of magic on her. One particularly hot afternoon, the three of them gathered inside the secret shed, the broken jukebox humming in the corner. Ben was elbow-deep in an engine part, Mason was sorting old records, and Victoria was dusting off a battered guitar she'd found, tucked behind a pile of tires. She strummed it experimentally. The sound was rough, strings worn thin, but her fingers found a simple, familiar chord. Ben looked up from his work, eyebrows raised. "You play?" Victoria smiled shyly, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. "A little. My mother taught me before life got too busy." Ben leaned back against the workbench, crossing his arms. "Let's hear it, then." Victoria hesitated. It had been years, decades even, since she had played for anyone. But something about the way Mason watched her, hope shining in his eyes, made it impossible to say no. She took a breath, fingers trembling slightly, and began to play. It was a simple tune, a little wobbly at first, but as she settled in, the chords warmed and smoothed, filling the small shed with a sweet, aching sound. Mason clapped his hands, laughing in delight. Ben smiled, a rare, unguarded smile that softened the hard lines etched by too many years of sorrow. "You know," Ben said when the song ended, "you're not half bad, Queen LaRue." Victoria laughed, the sound light and free. "Don't let the tiara fool you. I've got a few tricks up my sleeve." Mason piped up, voice bright. "Daddy sings too, but he doesn't do it much anymore." Ben ruffled his son's hair, embarrassed. "Used to sing to your mama," he admitted quietly. "She always loved the old songs." Victoria's smile faltered for a moment, a shadow crossing her face. She recognized that particular ache, the kind that never really went away. "You should sing again," Victoria said softly, her eyes steady on his. Ben shrugged, trying for casual. "Maybe someday." But something had shifted in the air between them, a delicate bridge built from shared losses and hesitant hope. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the horizon in molten gold, Mason found a battered harmonica in a dusty box. He pressed it into Victoria's hands with all the solemnity of a knight bestowing a sacred relic. "For you," he said simply. Victoria blinked, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Mason, I can't take this. It's yours?" The boy shook his head fiercely. "Mama used to say music is better when you share it." Ben watched the exchange, his chest tightening. Mason hadn't spoken about his mother so openly in months. Victoria knelt to meet Mason's gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. "I'll take very good care of it." She cradled the harmonica in her palms as if it were a priceless treasure. In a way, it was. That night, after Mason had gone to bed, Victoria lingered in the shed, sitting cross-legged on the floor, softly coaxing a few shaky notes from the old harmonica. Outside, the warm Texas breeze stirred the dry grass, carrying with it the scent of oil and earth, and something sweeter, something like hope. Ben watched her from the doorway, leaning silently against the frame. In the fading light, she looked impossibly young and heartbreakingly vulnerable. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Some moments spoke louder than words. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm, like the gentle ticking of an old clock. Victoria found herself returning to Ben's garage almost every afternoon, drawn by a force she couldn't quite name. It wasn't the jukebox, though she and Mason were slowly coaxing life back into it, with careful hands and bright laughter. It wasn't the repairs, or even the dusty little shed with its mismatched treasures. It was the way this place made her feel. Unjudged, unhurried, unmasked. Ben noticed the change, though he didn't say much. He'd grown up knowing that healing couldn't be forced. It had to happen in its own stubborn, meandering way, like a cracked riverbed, slowly filling again after a long drought. That particular afternoon, the air was heavy with the sweet smell of impending rain. Clouds stacked against the horizon like weary travelers. Inside the garage, the faint strains of Mason's humming floated through the open bay door as he carefully wiped down the newly restored jukebox with a soft cloth. Victoria sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, harmonica resting in her lap. Her sundress was smudged with grease, and her hair had slipped from its neat braid, framing her face in loose, careless waves. Ben watched from his workbench, pretending to sort bolts, but really just soaking in the scene before him. It struck him again how natural she looked here, how far removed she seemed from the high-gloss, untouchable world she'd come from. "You're getting good with that," Ben said casually, nodding toward the harmonica. Victoria smiled, but didn't lift it to her lips. Instead, she traced its worn edges with a finger, her expression turning thoughtful. "My mother loved music," she said quietly. "She wasn't fancy. She liked simple things, old records, backyard dances, Sunday afternoons singing along to the radio." Ben set down the wrench in his hand, sensing the shift in her tone. Mason, sensing it too, grew still beside her. "My father," Victoria continued, her voice growing brittle, "thought all that was a waste of time. He wanted me polished, perfect. No time for music or small-town nonsense, only ambition." She looked up, meeting Ben's steady gaze. "I used to play guitar on the porch with my mother when he was away on business trips. She'd teach me songs from her childhood, songs like 'You Are My Sunshine.'" Victoria's voice trembled slightly. "When she died, I packed away the guitar. I packed away all of it." Ben didn't interrupt. He knew when words were less important than presence. Victoria swallowed hard, blinking back the sheen in her eyes. "Somewhere along the way, I forgot who I was supposed to be. Or maybe I just stopped trying." Mason leaned over and placed a small, grubby hand over hers, where it rested on the harmonica. His touch was simple, childlike, and yet profound. Ben cleared his throat gently. "Sometimes," he said, voice low, "it takes losing everything you think matters to find what really does." Victoria let out a shaky laugh. "Sounds like you know something about that." Ben nodded once, his face unreadable. "Lost my wife 4 years ago. Cancer. She fought like hell. But in the end," he shrugged, a gesture too small for the enormity of the loss. Victoria's chest tightened painfully. Here, in this dusty garage, with its peeling paint and creaky jukebox, she had found two souls who understood the language of broken things. The silence after music stops, the hollow places that words can't fill. For a long moment, the three of them simply sat there in the growing dusk, the weight of shared sorrow settling between them like a tender, fragile bridge. Then, in a small, brave voice, Mason whispered, "Will you sing with me, Miss Victoria?" Victoria hesitated, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She hadn't sung, really sung, for anyone in years. But Mason's eyes were wide and earnest, and something inside her, long buried, stirred. She nodded. Ben reached over to the jukebox and gave it a gentle thump. Miraculously, the machine sputtered to life, crackling and popping before settling into a warbly, familiar tune. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." Victoria's voice joined Mason's, tentative at first, then stronger. She sang through the lump in her throat, through the fear and the memories, letting the simple, aching beauty of the song carry her. Ben didn't sing, but he sat there, head bowed, listening as the two voices, one high and sweet, the other soft and rich, wove together in the dusty twilight. When the song ended, Mason clapped his hands delightedly, and Victoria laughed through her tears. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was real. And for the first time in a very long time, Victoria LaRue felt whole. As they packed up for the evening, Mason chattered excitedly about starting a band and playing at the next town fair. Ben chuckled, promising to dig out his old guitar. Victoria lingered a moment longer, glancing back at the shed, bathed in the soft golden glow of the setting sun. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight, here in this tiny, forgotten corner of the world, she had found something precious, a song for the broken, and maybe, just maybe, a new beginning. The Saturday sun rose golden and heavy over the little town of Willow Creek, casting long, lazy shadows across cracked sidewalks and rusted street lamps. It was the day of the annual harvest fair, a modest but beloved tradition filled with pie contests, three-legged races, and booths selling homemade jams and quilts. For the townsfolk, it was a day of laughter and neighborly pride. For Victoria LaRue, it felt like stepping onto another planet. She stood uncertainly at the edge of the town square, dressed in a simple denim skirt and a white cotton blouse. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and a pair of worn cowboy boots, borrowed from Ben's late wife's old closet, graced her feet. She tugged self-consciously at the hem of her blouse, feeling oddly exposed without her usual armor of designer suits and polished heels. Ben spotted her first. He was helping set up the stage near the gazebo, his flannel sleeves rolled up, sawdust dusting his arms. He gave a low whistle and tipped his cap. "Well, look at you, Miss LaRue. Almost look like you belong here." Victoria managed a shaky laugh. "Don't get your hopes up. I'm pretty sure I'll trip over my own feet before the day's out." "You'll fit right in then," Ben said with a wink. Mason, already buzzing with excitement, ran over and grabbed her hand. "Come on, Miss Victoria. You gotta see the pie-eating contest." Victoria let herself be pulled along, her initial nerves melting under the boys' enthusiasm. They passed booths lined with jars of pickles, tables stacked with quilts, and children darting between stalls with balloons tied to their wrists. Everywhere she turned, people smiled and nodded in greeting. No one asked for a photo. No one whispered behind manicured hands. Here, she wasn't a headline or a scandal. She was just Victoria. Ben watched her from a distance, a small smile tugging at his mouth. He could see her shoulders loosening, her laughter becoming more real, more full. She was, he realized, beautiful when she forgot to be perfect. Later that afternoon, as the sun climbed high and the fair hit its stride, the organizers announced the annual tug-of-war challenge, a fiercely competitive tradition between the north and south sides of town. Ben was roped into the north side team with predictable, good-natured grumbling. Mason, of course, cheered loudest. "You should join," Mason urged Victoria, bouncing on the balls of his feet. Victoria laughed, shaking her head. "Me? No way." But then the announcer spotted her and called out through the loudspeaker. "Well, folks, looks like we've got some new blood here today. Miss, Victoria, come on down." A chorus of cheers and whistles erupted from the crowd. Victoria flushed bright red. Ben sauntered over, offering his hand. "Come on, Queen LaRue. You said you wanted to try the real Willow Creek experience." Before she could think better of it, Victoria found herself gripping the thick, scratchy rope alongside Ben, her boots digging into the dirt. Across from her, a rowdy group from the south side grinned mischievously. "Ready, set, pull!" The rope jerked, and Victoria stumbled, laughing despite herself. Ben planted his feet beside her, steady and solid, and together they heaved. Dust swirled, boots slipped, laughter roared. Victoria's arms ached, her legs burned, but she laughed harder than she had in years. With a final mighty pull, the north side tumbled backward in a heap, victorious but gloriously muddy. Victoria lay in the dirt, gasping for breath, her sides aching from laughter. Mason ran to her side, his grin so wide it nearly split his face. "You were awesome!" he shouted. Ben extended a hand to help her up, and when she took it, their fingers lingered just a moment too long. Victoria brushed dust from her skirt, grinning like a fool. "Well," she said, "there goes my dignity." Ben chuckled, handing her a bottle of water. "You're in Willow Creek now. Dignity's optional." They spent the rest of the afternoon wandering the fair, sharing paper plates piled high with barbecue and slices of homemade peach pie. Victoria even tried her hand at the dunk tank, laughing as she failed miserably at hitting the target. As dusk fell, the town square lit up with strings of fairy lights. Mason clutched a caramel apple in one hand and Victoria's hand in the other as they made their way toward the stage. The old jukebox, newly repaired and gleaming under the lights, sat proudly in a corner. Someone slipped in a quarter, and a familiar tune crackled to life. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." Without hesitation, Mason dragged Victoria toward the open space in front of the gazebo. "Come on," he urged. Ben watched, heart swelling, as Victoria twirled Mason clumsily under the golden lights, her laughter mingling with the old song. Other couples joined them, old farmers with their wives, teenagers in worn jeans, mothers swaying with sleepy toddlers. Victoria caught Ben's eye across the crowd and smiled, really smiled. Not the practiced smile of boardrooms and photo ops, but a smile that crinkled her eyes and lit up her entire being. In that moment, Ben saw not the luxury car queen, not the heiress or the headline, but the woman underneath it all, the one who had lost so much and yet still found the courage to dance again. He moved toward her, drawn like a moth to a flame. When he reached her, he didn't ask. He simply offered his hand. Victoria placed her hand in his without hesitation, and there, beneath the fairy lights and the star-lit Texas sky, they danced. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was enough. The week after the harvest fair unfolded like a dream Victoria never wanted to wake from. Each day blended into the next, in a warm, sunlit rhythm. Afternoons spent helping Ben tinker with engines, evenings teaching Mason to strum simple chords on an old guitar, nights sitting on the rickety porch, sharing stories under the vast Texas sky. For the first time in years, Victoria felt something stir within her, something tender and terrifying, a fragile hope that maybe she could belong somewhere, be someone more than a carefully crafted image. But dreams, as she had long ago learned, were delicate things. And the world she had left behind wasn't finished with her yet. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Victoria was wiping her hands on a rag after helping Mason organize a shelf of old carburetors when she noticed Ben standing by the garage door, frowning at his phone. "What's wrong?" she asked lightly, brushing dust from her knees. Ben didn't answer at first. He simply turned the screen toward her. Victoria's heart dropped. There, plastered across a slick entertainment news site, was a photograph of her, laughing with Mason at the harvest fair, her denim skirt dusty, her boots scuffed. The headline screamed, "Luxury car queen slumming it? Heiress spotted getting cozy with small-town mechanic." Victoria's stomach twisted into knots as she scrolled through the article. It painted her time in Willow Creek as some reckless escapade, complete with snide commentary about playing poor and abandoning her corporate empire for a handsome handyman and his ragtag kid. Ben's voice broke the heavy silence. "Is it true?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "All that stuff about you, running an empire?" Victoria swallowed hard. It was true. Once. Ben leaned back against the doorframe, arms crossed. His face gave nothing away, but Victoria could feel the shift in the air, the careful wall sliding up between them. "I should have told you," she said, voice low. I didn't know how." Ben nodded slowly, his gaze unreadable. "You said you were tired of people seeing you for your name, but hiding it ain't much different." The words stung, but she knew he was right. Mason, sensing the tension, wandered over, his little brow furrowed. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked in a small voice. Victoria knelt quickly, pulling him into a hug. "No, sweetheart, you did everything right." Ben sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Victoria, I don't care about your money. Never did. But honesty, that matters around here." She nodded, blinking fast against the sudden burn behind her eyes. "I'll go," she said, forcing the words out past the lump in her throat. "I didn't come here to cause trouble." Ben didn't argue. He didn't tell her to stay. That hurt worse than any headline ever could. Victoria rose on shaky legs, dusting off her skirt mechanically. She retrieved her purse from the workbench and headed for her car, Mason trailing after her, confused and upset. "Miss Victoria," he called. "Where are you going?" She turned, forcing a smile. "I've got some things to figure out, buddy." Mason's face crumpled, and Victoria's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Ben stood silently, watching her go. The engine of her car rumbled to life, and she drove away from the garage, from the laughter, from the warmth that had almost made her believe she could start over. As the town disappeared in her rearview mirror, Victoria felt the old, familiar numbness creep back in, like frost reclaiming ground too briefly thawed. She booked a room at the small inn on the outskirts of town, a faded place with creaky floors and threadbare curtains. It suited her mood perfectly. For hours, she sat on the stiff bed, scrolling through endless headlines, each more vicious than the last. Photos of her at the fair, her dancing with Mason, her laughing with Ben. Each image twisted into something ugly, something shameful. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall. She had fought too hard, lost too much, to be undone by gossip and assumptions. But still, it hurt. God, it hurt. A soft knock came at the door just past sunset. Victoria wiped her face quickly and opened it. Mason stood there, clutching his new red toy truck in one hand, his eyes wide and solemn. "I don't care what they say," he said fiercely. "You're my friend." Victoria dropped to her knees, wrapping him in a fierce hug. "You're my sunshine, Mason," she whispered, voice breaking. A second later, Ben stepped into the hallway behind him, his expression guarded, but no longer cold. He shifted awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. "Look," he said gruffly, "you don't have to run." Victoria straightened slowly, searching his face. "I messed up," she said. "I should have been honest from the start." Ben shrugged. "Maybe. But around here, we believe in fixing things that are worth fixing." He held out his hand. Victoria hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her own in his, feeling the calluses, the strength, the forgiveness. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a movie ending, but it was real. And for the first time that day, Victoria allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't lost everything after all. Victoria had always believed that broken things stayed broken. In her world, reputations, trust, even people, once shattered, they were tossed aside like wreckage after a storm. That was simply how life worked in the circles she had once moved through. No second chances, no forgiveness. But Willow Creek was teaching her something different. The next morning, she woke early, sunlight slanting through the thin curtains of the inn's small room. Outside, the sky stretched wide and impossibly blue, dotted with lazy clouds. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Gone was the woman in designer suits and high heels. In her place stood someone. Softer. Worn, perhaps, but stronger in ways that no amount of wealth could buy. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and made a decision. It was time to stop running. Ben was already elbow-deep in a transmission when Victoria pulled into the garage's dusty lot. Mason spotted her first, dropping his wrench and sprinting across the gravel with a shout. "Miss Victoria!" She barely had time to brace herself before the boy collided with her, wrapping skinny arms around her waist. Ben straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, watching her with guarded eyes. Victoria knelt and ruffled Mason's hair. "Think your daddy might have room for an extra set of hands today?" Mason grinned wide. "We always got room." Ben approached, his movements slow, cautious. Victoria stood, facing him squarely. "I can't change where I come from," she said, "and I can't promise the past won't catch up again. But if you'll have me, I'd like to stay." Ben studied her for a long moment. Then, with a small, tired smile, he said simply, "You're already here." And just like that, the last wall between them crumbled. That afternoon, dark clouds began to gather over Willow Creek, heavy and bruised with the promise of rain. Ben checked the weathered radio perched on the workbench and frowned. "They're saying it's going to be a bad one." Victoria helped Mason gather tools and supplies, hauling everything inside the shed. She moved with purpose, sleeves rolled up, not shying away from the grit and grime. She was part of this place now, and she intended to prove it. The first fat drops of rain began to fall just as they slammed the shed doors shut. Thunder rumbled across the open fields like a warning drum. Inside, the old jukebox flickered weakly, its neon lights blinking against the encroaching gloom. Ben lit an oil lamp, the warm glow throwing soft shadows against the walls. Victoria and Mason huddled close, the small space suddenly feeling very precious. Outside, the storm raged. Wind howled. Rain hammered the tin roof. Somewhere in the distance, the unmistakable wail of a tornado siren split the air. Ben's face tightened. "Stay here," he ordered. "I'll check the main house." But before he could step into the gale, Victoria grabbed his arm. "Don't go alone," she said fiercely. "We're stronger together." Ben hesitated, then nodded. They dashed through the sheets of rain, Mason tucked between them, slipping and stumbling across the muddy lot. The main house, Ben's modest, weather-beaten ranch, stood sturdy against the wind. Inside, it was dark, but solid, the thick walls muffling the worst of the storm's fury. They collapsed onto the living room floor, soaked to the bone, but laughing breathlessly, adrenaline buzzing in their veins. Mason climbed into Victoria's lap without hesitation, shivering slightly. She wrapped her arms around him instinctively, holding him close, holding herself together. Ben tossed her an old quilt from the couch. "It ain't much, but it's warm." Victoria smiled, tucking it around Mason's small frame. The storm raged outside, furious and wild, but inside, there was only the soft tick of the old clock, the crackle of rain on the roof, and the steady, comforting presence of 3 battered hearts finding shelter in each other. Later, when the worst had passed, and the rain softened to a gentle patter, Ben found his guitar in the corner. He hadn't touched it in years. It still wore the dust of lost days. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like something worth remembering. He sat on the edge of the couch, strumming a few tentative chords. The sound was rough, imperfect, but alive. Victoria watched, heart in her throat as Ben began to sing. "When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me." The old Beatles song filled the small living room, wrapping around them like another quilt, stitched together from all the broken pieces they had carried for too long. Victoria joined him, her voice shaking, but steady. Mason hummed along, his head resting against her shoulder. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Victoria didn't feel like she was pretending. She didn't feel like she was performing. She just was. She was Victoria, the woman who could sand down old hubcaps, who could dance barefoot under fairy lights, who could love a stubborn mechanic and his brave, beautiful son with all the fierce, wild tenderness she had never known she possessed. When the song ended, Ben looked at her across the dim room and said, in a voice rough with emotion, "Welcome home." Victoria blinked back tears. She didn't need mansions. She didn't need boardrooms. She didn't even need a last name. She needed this. She needed them. And maybe, just maybe, they needed her too. The storm had passed, but its mark lingered. Branches littered the streets of Willow Creek. Fences leaned at odd angles. Some roofs had lost a few shingles, and the town square looked battered and bruised. Ben's garage had taken its share of damage too. The old shed where Mason and Victoria had spent so many hours was still standing. But the main shop, the heart of Ben's work, his pride, had suffered a brutal blow. A section of the roof had caved in, the walls warped and water-stained. Ben stood silently in front of the wreckage, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His jaw was clenched, but Victoria could see the tension radiating off him like heat waves. Mason kicked at a stray piece of metal, his small face somber. Victoria knelt beside him and squeezed his shoulder gently. "It's just wood and nails," she said softly. "What matters most is right here." She placed a hand over his heart, then touched his cheek. Mason's eyes widened slightly, and he gave a shy nod. Ben said nothing, but his shoulders eased just a little. Still, Victoria could see the unspoken worry gnawing at him. Repairs would cost money, more than Ben had. And though he would never say it, Victoria knew. Without the garage, there was no future here for him and Mason. That night, long after Ben had put Mason to bed, Victoria sat alone in the kitchen, nursing a cup of weak coffee and staring out into the moonlit fields. She thought about everything this place had given her. The music, the laughter, the small miracles stitched into everyday moments. They had given her second chances without asking for anything in return. It was time she did the same. The next morning, Victoria drove into town and parked outside the Willow Creek Community Bank. Inside, the manager, a kindly man named Mr. Tompkins, greeted her with polite curiosity. "I need to set up a donation," Victoria said, smiling warmly. He blinked. "Donation?" She nodded. "Anonymously, to help rebuild Ben Carter's garage." Mr. Tompkins hesitated. "That's mighty generous, ma'am. But you don't have to." "I want to," Victoria interrupted gently. "And not just the garage. The town needs help too. The fairgrounds, the library, the park. Small things, maybe, but important things." The banker studied her for a moment longer, then nodded, understanding something deeper passing between them. Victoria filled out the forms with a steady hand, listing the donor as a friend of Willow Creek. She didn't want recognition. She didn't want headlines. She just wanted to repay a kindness that had cracked her frozen heart wide open. Meanwhile, back at the garage, Ben surveyed the mess with grim determination. He'd built this place once. He could do it again, even if it took every last dime he had. He was bent over a stack of salvaged wood when Mason came running up, waving a flyer in his hand. "Daddy, look!" Ben took the paper, frowning at the neat lettering. "Community Rebuild Project, funded by a friend." It outlined plans for repairs all over town, including a complete restoration of Ben's garage. "Who?" Ben trailed off, confused. Mason grinned. "Miss Victoria's a friend." Ben's heart stuttered. He turned toward the road just in time to see Victoria's beat-up pickup disappearing around the bend. a flash of blonde hair visible through the dusty windshield. For a long moment, Ben simply stood there, holding the paper, feeling the tightness in his chest loosen, little by little. It wasn't just the money. It was the faith. The belief that he, and this town, were worth saving. That evening, the townsfolk gathered at the square for an impromptu meeting. Word had spread like wildfire about the mysterious donation. Ben found Victoria sitting quietly on a bench near the gazebo, Mason curled up beside her, half asleep. "You know," he said, easing down beside her, "around here, folks tend to like thanking their friends in person." Victoria smiled tiredly. "I didn't do it for thanks." Ben studied her in the soft glow of the fairy light strung overhead. Her face was open, unguarded. She looked at home. "Why'd you really do it?" he asked quietly. Victoria stared down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "Because you fixed something in me," she said after a long moment. "Something I thought was broken for good." Ben reached over and covered her hands with his own, steady and warm. "You were never broken," he said. "Just a little lost." Tears welled in Victoria's eyes, but she blinked them away, squeezing his fingers tightly. Around them, the townspeople laughed and swapped stories, rebuilding not just their homes, but their hope. Above, the stars blinked to life one by one, witnesses to a night stitched together by second-hand dreams, new beginnings, and the kind of love that didn't shout from the rooftops, but whispered in every small, stubborn act of grace. Willow Creek wore December like a homespun quilt, patched with fairy lights, stitched together with laughter and the smell of cinnamon drifting from kitchen windows. The town had worked miracles in a few short weeks. The garage stood proud again, its fresh coat of paint gleaming under the winter sun. The park boasted new benches and repaired swings. Even the library had gotten new shelves, courtesy of the anonymous friend of Willow Creek everyone still buzzed about. Victoria found herself at the heart of it all without even trying. Ben had taken to calling her boss lady whenever she rolled up her sleeves to help, which always earned him a glare and a half-hidden smile. Mason stuck to her side like glue, proudly introducing her to every neighbor, every shopkeeper, every stray cat within a 10-mile radius. It wasn't the life Victoria had imagined for herself all those years ago, when ambition had been the only thing keeping her upright. It was better. The town's Christmas festival approached faster than Victoria could believe. It was Ben's idea to hold the celebration at the newly rebuilt garage, a symbol, he said, of resilience and hope. Victoria suspected he also wanted to keep the town's aging church hall from collapsing under the weight of a few too many fruitcakes. By Christmas Eve, the garage had been transformed. Strings of lights crisscrossed the rafters. Tables overflowed with pies, hams, and steaming trays of tamales. The jukebox, newly restored to full glory, stood proudly in one corner, humming with anticipation. Victoria stood in the doorway, drinking it all in. The laughter, the clatter of dishes, the swell of music and life. "You did good," Ben said quietly beside her. Victoria turned, blinking against the sudden rush of emotion. "We all did." Ben nodded, but his gaze stayed on her, soft and steady. "No," he said. "You did." Before she could find an answer, Mason barreled toward them, breathless with excitement. "They're starting!" he cried, grabbing Victoria's hand. "Come on!" Ben chuckled and followed as Mason tugged Victoria toward the small stage set up near the back wall. Mayor Jackson, an affable man with a paunch and a voice made for auctioneering, tapped the microphone. "Evening, folks. Before we kick off the music, we got a special treat." He beamed out at the crowd. "Seems one of our own's been teaching this young fella a thing or two about music." Victoria glanced at Ben in confusion, but he just winked. Mason, cheeks flushed with excitement, scrambled onto the stage, clutching a small acoustic guitar almost as big as he was. Victoria's hands flew to her mouth. She hadn't known. She hadn't known Ben had been teaching him. Mason cleared his throat, eyes scanning the crowd nervously. When they landed on Victoria, he smiled, small but fierce. "I want to sing this for my Miss Victoria," he announced, voice piping into the microphone. The room fell into a hush so complete, Victoria could hear the faint buzz of the fairy lights overhead. Mason strummed the first shaky chords. Then, in a clear, sweet voice, he began. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." Victoria's breath caught. The song that had followed her from childhood. The song that had mended the broken places in her heart. Tears welled and spilled down her cheeks as Mason sang, his little voice gaining strength with each line. Ben moved beside her, his hand finding hers, squeezing gently. "You make me happy when skies are gray." Victoria didn't bother wiping her tears. She let them fall, let herself feel every raw, beautiful note. The whole town sang along by the final chorus. Farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, all lifting their voices together in a patchwork choir of imperfect, glorious sound. When the last note faded, Mason beamed and bowed dramatically, sending the crowd into cheers and whistles. Victoria rushed to the stage and scooped him into a fierce hug, laughing and crying all at once. "You were amazing," she whispered against his hair. Mason giggled. "I practiced every day. Daddy helped." Victoria turned to find Ben watching them, his expression so full of love it nearly stole her breath. He crossed the room slowly, the crowd parting instinctively to let him through. When he reached her, he didn't say anything. He just pulled her close, right there in front of the whole town, and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of fireworks or grand declarations. It was a kiss of home, of second chances, of promises stitched from laughter and forgiveness, and the slow, steady work of choosing each other every single day. When they broke apart, the crowd whooped and clapped, Mason pumping his little fist in the air in triumph. Victoria laughed, dizzy with happiness. Ben rested his forehead against hers. "Took me a while to catch up," he murmured. "But I'm here now." Victoria cupped his face in her hands, smiling through her tears. "So am I." And under the fairy lights, in the heart of a garage rebuilt by kindness, they began the first verse of a brand new song. The Christmas festival lingered like a beautiful dream. Long after the last slice of pie had been eaten and the last note had faded from the jukebox, the townsfolk began to drift home, trailing laughter and good wishes behind them. But Ben, Victoria, and Mason stayed behind, reluctant to let the night end. The garage was quieter now, lit only by the soft golden strands of fairy lights strung overhead. Outside, the cold air smelled of pine and wood smoke, wrapping the town in a hush that felt sacred. Ben leaned against the hood of an old truck. Mason perched beside him, still riding the high of his impromptu concert. Victoria stood a few feet away, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, gazing up at the stars. The sky was a velvet canvas, scattered with countless points of silver light. She felt the moment swelling in her chest, ripe, trembling, full of all the things she had never dared to hope for again. Home, family, love. She turned back toward the two most important people in her world now, the stubborn mechanic and the boy with a heart bigger than Texas. "Hey, Mason," she called softly. The boy looked up, face still glowing with excitement. Victoria dropped to one knee on the concrete floor, ignoring the chill seeping through her jeans. Ben straightened immediately, his body going tense with surprise. "Victoria, what?" But she held up a hand, her smile trembling but sure. "Mason Carter," she said formally, making the boy giggle. "I have a very important question for you." Mason's eyes went round as silver dollars. "Would you," Victoria said, her voice catching, "let me be part of your family? Forever?" Mason didn't hesitate. He launched himself into her arms with a joyful whoop, nearly knocking her over. "Yes," he cried. "Yes, yes, yes!" Victoria laughed, the sound thick with tears. She hugged him tightly, pressing her face into his tousled hair. Then she lifted her gaze to Ben, who was standing frozen, looking like someone had just punched all the air out of his lungs. "And you," Victoria said, rising slowly to her feet, her voice trembling. "Benjamin Carter, would you consider marrying me?" The garage seemed to hold its breath. Ben stared at her, wide-eyed. For a heartbeat, Victoria's heart faltered. Maybe she'd gone too far. Maybe it was too soon. But then Ben moved. In 3 long strides, he crossed the space between them and cupped her face in his hands. "You crazy, beautiful woman," he said, voice rough with wonder. "You had me the day you wrecked your fancy car and looked at me like I was the one saving you." Victoria's tears spilled over as he kissed her, fierce and tender all at once. Mason cheered from the sidelines, pumping his fists in the air like a miniature coach celebrating a game-winning touchdown. When they broke apart, Ben rested his forehead against hers, both of them laughing through their tears. "Is that a yes?" Victoria whispered, her breath mingling with his. "It's a hell yes," Ben said, and the stars overhead seemed to burn a little brighter in celebration. They sat together on the hood of the old truck afterward, wrapped in a blanket Ben had pulled from the back seat. Mason dozed against Victoria's side, his caramel apple long forgotten in his lap. Ben strummed the guitar softly, his fingers finding a familiar, comforting tune. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine," Victoria sang along, her voice blending with Ben's in a quiet, perfect harmony. It wasn't a grand proposal with chandeliers and champagne. It was better. It was a promise made under battered rafters and fairy lights, witnessed by a boy who had taught them both how to believe again. Later that night, long after Mason had been carried home and tucked into bed, Ben and Victoria stood on the porch of the ranch house, looking out over the dark fields. Snow had started to fall, soft, slow flakes that turned the world silver and new. Victoria slipped her hand into Ben's. "I spent a long time chasing the wrong dreams," she said quietly. "And I thought, maybe that was all life had for me. Empty houses, empty victories." Ben squeezed her hand. "You found your real dream," he said. "Right here." Victoria smiled, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming fullness in her chest. "You," she whispered. "It was you all along." Ben leaned down and kissed her again. Slow, sweet, certain. Behind them, the Christmas lights twinkled. In front of them, a new life stretched out, as wide and open as the Texas sky. And above it all, the stars bore witness to a promise that was stronger than any fortune, any headline, any storm. The promise of love, hard-won, fiercely kept, and stitched together from second-hand dreams and first-chance hearts. Spring unfurled across Willow Creek like a long-held breath finally released. Wild flowers dappled the fields beyond Ben's ranch, painting the landscape in soft splashes of gold, violet, and white. The air smelled of earth and new beginnings, sweet and clean after the long winter. Victoria stood barefoot on the porch, the wood warm beneath her feet, a steaming mug of coffee cupped in her hands. She watched the sunrise set the horizon ablaze, its light spilling across the world like a benediction. Inside, she could hear Mason banging around in the kitchen, narrating an elaborate imaginary battle between a spatula and a bowl of pancake batter. Ben's low chuckle rumbled in response, a sound so familiar now that it had become stitched into the fabric of her mornings. Victoria smiled into her coffee. This life, this ordinary, extraordinary life, was the greatest miracle she had ever known. The wedding had been simple by Willow Creek standards, small, joyful, and stitched together by the calloused hands and generous hearts of the town. Victoria had worn a dress borrowed from Miss Edna, the town librarian, and a crown of fresh wildflowers Mason had insisted on weaving himself. Ben had worn his best flannel shirt and the same worn boots he used for church on Sundays, and Mason, standing proudly between them, had served as best man, ring bearer, and official lead singer, belting out "You Are My Sunshine" with such unfiltered joy that half the town had wept into their handkerchiefs. There were no reporters, no glossy magazine spreads, just laughter, just love, just the simple, stubborn promise that no matter what storms life hurled their way, they would stand together. As the sun climbed higher, Victoria wandered down the porch steps and into the backyard. Ben was tinkering with Mason's rusted bicycle, tightening the chain, while Mason offered enthusiastic, if not exactly helpful, advice. "Maybe we can put rockets on it," Mason suggested. Ben raised an eyebrow. "Let's get the training wheels off first, cowboy." Victoria laughed, a low, rich sound she hadn't known she was capable of before Willow Creek. She crossed the yard, crouching beside Ben. "Need a hand?" He looked up, a smudge of grease across his forehead, and grinned. "Always." Their fingers brushed over the wrench, lingering longer than necessary. Still newlyweds, still ridiculously in love, still building something beautiful from second-hand dreams and first-chance hopes. Later that afternoon, they drove into town for the spring festival. Mason's idea, of course. The square was alive with music and the smell of roasting corn. Kids chased each other with painted faces. Elderly couples rocked side by side on folding chairs, sipping lemonade and watching the world turn gently around them. Ben slipped his hand into Victoria's as they wandered from booth to booth, Mason darting ahead like a happy little comet. At one point, Victoria paused by a table selling hand-stitched quilts. Her fingers brushed a faded square embroidered with sunflowers and music notes. The old woman behind the table smiled. "You look like someone who knows how to appreciate second chances," she said kindly. Victoria smiled back, her throat tight. "I do," she whispered. She bought the quilt without hesitation, cradling it against her chest as they wandered onward. That evening, after the sun dipped low and painted the world in soft watercolors, the townsfolk gathered around the gazebo for the final concert of the day. Ben tuned his guitar while Mason perched beside him, tapping his foot impatiently. Victoria sat on the grass at their feet, the new quilt spread out beneath her, feeling more at home than she had anywhere in her entire life. Ben strummed a familiar chord, and Mason grinned, picking up the melody instantly. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." The crowd joined in, voices rising into the warm, violet twilight. Victoria sang too, her voice steady, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. When the song ended, there was a pause, a breathless, golden hush. Then the applause erupted, warm and raucous and real. Ben set down his guitar and reached for her hand, pulling her to her feet. Without a word, they danced there under the stars, spinning slowly, surrounded by friends who had become family. Mason darted between them, laughing and singing, a tiny whirlwind of joy. And somewhere, in the back of Victoria's mind, she could hear her mother's voice, soft and sure. "Happiness isn't something you chase, honey. It's something you build, one small, stubborn miracle at a time." Victoria closed her eyes and held on tightly to the man and the boy who had taught her how to build again, how to dream again, how to love again. Not perfectly, not without scars, but completely, fiercely, forever. Later, As the last notes of music faded into the night and the stars wheeled overhead, Victoria sat on the porch of the little ranch house. Mason curled against her side, Ben's arms slung loosely around her shoulders. The world smelled of lilacs and clean earth, of promises kept and new ones whispered. She tilted her face up to the sky, smiling. Home wasn't a place you found on a map. Home was a battered jukebox singing under the rafters. Home was a crooked porch, light left burning. Home was a grease-stained mechanic and a boy with a heart bigger than the horizon. Home was where the broken things got mended, where sunshine was stitched into second-hand dreams, and where love, quiet, stubborn, miraculous love, shone forever. Before you go, we'd love to know, where are you watching from tonight? Whether it's a small town, a big city, or a quiet farmhouse tucked away under the stars, your story matters here. Feel free to share it with us in the comments below. It's a joy to see how far kindness can travel and how many hearts it can quietly touch. If this story brought you even a small moment of warmth, if it reminded you of the power of simple goodness, we warmly invite you to subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep these stories alive, and maybe, just maybe, make the world a little softer, one heart at a time. Thank you for sitting with us a while. Thank you for listening with an open heart. In a world that sometimes moves too fast, your presence here means everything. Until next time, may your days be filled with gentle light, and your journey always lead you home. Kindness doesn't just heal the broken, it lights the way home.